All right, it's 12 o'clock, so let's get going. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. I'm Joan Plank, Chair of the Oregon State Capitol Foundation. We partner with Visitor Services to have these speaker series. We have the one today, and we have two others coming up next month, which I'll mention to you at the end. Anyway, we're just so excited to have these books for people to hear about and what's going on. The presentation today, we welcome Barbara Mahoney, who may be a familiar face to some of you. She's a historian whose interest in Oregon history began when she moved, and her family moved to Salem in 1976. She has contributed a number of entries to the Oregon Encyclopedia and is author of Dispatches and Dictators, a biography of Oregon native Ralph Barnes, who was a foreign correspondent in Europe in the 1930s. I just heard her giving some background on him. That sounds like a very interesting book as well, so we'll see if we can find that one. And she won the Oregon Book Award for Literary Nonfiction in 2003. Today she's going to be speaking about the Salem Clique, as you all know, and I'm fascinated to hear more about that. The book will be for sale in the gift shop after this presentation, and Barbara will be autographing. And we will have time for questions at the end of Barbara's presentation as well. So, thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate seeing you here. The Salem Clique was a very interesting group of young men. They played an important role in the politics of Oregon during the Oregon Territory period, so the 1850s. They held a number of offices, and the most powerful of them, Azel Bush, was the editor and publisher of the most powerful newspaper in Oregon, the Oregon Statesman. Thomas Dreyer, who was the publisher and editor of the rival newspaper, the Oregonian, in Portland, was the one who first named the Salem Clique. He called them guilty of deception, corruption, and dictatorship. He even of conspiring with Brigham Young to make Oregon a polygamous Mormon republic. A little background. Oregon first came to the eyes of the world with a Spanish explorer, but the Spanish tried to keep the discovery secret. But the British were interested, as were the Americans. The British sent several, mostly to check on what the fur business might be. They sent a number of people here, including George Vancouver, whose name you will recognize. The Americans did as well. The Lewis and Clark expedition, of course, and then John Jacob Astor, who came to establish the fur trade in the interest of the Americans, and of course, named Fort Astoria. Unfortunately, he then sold his company to a British company. That was the end of that. In 1818, the British and the Americans formed something that is really very unusual in history, a joint occupation of the Oregon Territory. It was the land west of the Rockies, from the California border up to 5440 north, which is that touches that southern tip of Alaska, which of course then was Russian. Included the lands of British Columbia, Oregon, Washington, parts of Idaho, and Montana. The English sent the Hudson's Bay Company here. Again, their interest was in the fur trade. Dr. John McLaughlin was their head. He started in Astoria, then moved to Vancouver, and then finally pretty much established Oregon City. He became an object of hatred by the Americans here, but actually was a pretty generous individual. The French came. They were French-Canadian trappers who, when they retired from the fur trade business, married Indian women and went to what we now know as the French Prairie and farmed there. The Americans came, you all know about Jason Lee and the Willamette University, the Mission Party, which he formed. He was so terrible with regard to John McLaughlin that he ended up being recalled by the Methodist organization in the East and got out of here. In 1843, the people who had settled in the area joined together at Champoeg with the idea of establishing a provisional government. There were two factions, the American settlers on the one hand, and on the other hand, the English, the French Canadians, and the Catholics, because there was a problem for Catholics on the American side. They put together the Organic Act in 1843. It had a 3-member executive committee, later became an elected governor, a secretary and treasurer, a 10-member legislative committee, had the customary protection of individual rights, and mandated, ineffectively, that the utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. They banned slavery throughout the territory and then added that any people who brought slaves to Oregon had 3 years to get them out of here. They also excluded African Americans and provided that, quote, free Negroes should leave within 2 years under penalty of being flogged by the constable. The Act also provided 320 acres of land to any white man coming to the territory. There was a shortage of women. If they were married, they could get 640 acres. So they made it legal for 12-year-olds to marry, 12-year-old girls, of course. In 1844, James K. Polk was the Democratic presidential candidate and had what is perhaps the most famous campaign slogan of all time, 54, 40, or fight. He wanted the Americans to take the entire land of the Oregon Territory, including that the British had settled in. He was talked out of it. He wanted to go to war. But John C. Calhoun, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, or of State, said, we're not going to do that, partly because a war with Mexico was coming. In 1846, Buchanan, the Secretary of State, and the interior person in Britain formulated the Buchanan-Pakenham Treaty, which set the boundary between the United States and the British holdings at 49 degrees, which is pretty much where it is now. We did give them the whole of Vancouver Island, but otherwise that's the border between the United States and Canada. In 1847, the people of the territory petitioned Washington to create a territorial government here. They wrote, "We, a small, distant, and poor community of few citizens in Oregon, shall be the sole solitary victims of our country's neglect and injustice." It was this that pierced our heart. There was considerable debate in Congress. Oregon was too far away. In the 1850s, it took about a month for news to come. There was also the concerns of the slave states because Oregon had outlawed slavery. A better suggestion in the eyes of many was for the settlers, both the British and the American settlers, to form the Pacific Republic. It would, they simply didn't think that Oregon was worth the cross-country trip, and whether it was simply too distant to ever be a part of the United States. The settlers turned that one down. And in 1848, the territory was created with Oregon City as its capital. There was a governor, and the rest of the executive and judicial branches were appointed by the president. The territorial legislature was elected by white male adult settlers. The legislature held annual sessions. The highest elected official was the delegate to Congress. He represented the territory's interests. He did not, however, have the right to vote in Congress, so we would today, I think, consider him pretty much a lobbyist. The person who first held that job was Samuel Thurston. He came to Oregon in 1847. He was an avowed Democrat. He also had a Methodist background and so was pretty brutal to John McLaughlin. He campaigned for delegate of Congress on his opposition to alcohol, Romanism, and McLaughlin. Romanism, of course, was the Catholic Church. He won election. He was a very enthusiastic promoter of the territory. He said, "Bring all your guns to bear and reach Oregon, for if you land there without staff or scrip and having but one coat or none at all, you have nothing to fear. Money is plenty, the highest wages are paid for men's and women's labor, and we have a generous and free people who know how to sympathize with another's woes and hardships." In another case, he wrote, after California became the 31st state in 1850, destiny has decreed for Oregon a standing that California can never have. Thurston got passed through Congress the Oregon donation land law, essentially the same law that had been passed in the provincial government. People came by the thousands. They came mostly to the Willamette Valley. Some came by the land route, the Oregon Trail, 2,000 miles, first on horseback, later by wagon train, and they often sailed back down the Columbia River. There was one sea route that took them from the East Coast to Panama. Then they came across the isthmus on mules. Then they sailed to San Francisco and then on to Portland. And then there was the other sea route that went all the way around the Cape of Good Horn. Thurston got word that the Whigs were planning a newspaper in Portland. Portland was then a town of 700 people, and the leaders were determined that Portland, rather than Oregon City or Milwaukee, would become the trading center. All of this made Thurston, the Democrat, see the need for a Democratic newspaper, to further his own career. He went back to, actually his wife's family lived in Massachusetts, and he was looking for someone who might be able to be the editor of his paper. He ran into Azel Bush. Bush had a printing and editorial background. He was also, had passed the bar, so he was a lawyer, and he was town clerk. Thurston convinced him to come to Oregon and do two things: establish the newspaper and organize the Democratic Party. He cautioned Bush, "Have your party dignified with chaste and gentlemanly language." That didn't happen. He arrived in Oregon City, then the capital, via the Panama route in September of 1850, having been seasick all the way. Meanwhile, the Whigs in Portland had hired Thomas Dreyer. He was born in Canandaigua County in New York. He had some newspaper experience. He had come to San Francisco for the gold rush. He had a press. He was looking for a job, so they hired him. Newspapers, there were a couple others by that time in Oregon. They were mostly opinion and marketing. The Oregonian, when it was founded, was a 4-page weekly. It began its publication in December of 1850 with the motto, "Equal rights, equal laws, equal justice for all." The Statesman began in March of 1851. It promised universal tolerance in religion and truth, temperance, sobriety, and industry. Its motto was, "No favor sways us, no fear shall awe." It quickly became the leading newspaper in the territory. Bush was a much better businessman than Dreyer. He was a great writer. He pushed significant issues, and his humor, sarcastic humor. He got a very substantial readership very quickly, even among those who disagreed with him politically. He took on the other newspapers in the territory. In the second issue of his paper, he accused the Oregonian of the grossest personal abuse, the most foul-mouthed slander, groveling scurrility, falsehood, and ribald blackguardism. Dreyer responded, "If there is any animal meaner than the slimy, creeping reptile, it is the cowardly slanderer, paid libeler, and miserable lickspittle of the Oregonian," or of the Oregon Statesman, rather. Bush referred to the founder and editor of the Oregon Argus, William Lysander Adams, who was a minister, as Parson Billy of the Air Goose. On the other hand, Adams called Bush ass of hell and regularly suggested that Bush took his pay in product for the advertisements of Dr. Zapke's Medicine for the Restoration of Lost Manhood. That's the way it was. In founding the Democratic Party, Bush had to look for a good deal of help. And it was in that help that he found and founded the Salem Clique. The first person that he attracted was Matthew Deedy, whom you all know. Deedy had moved around a great deal as a child. He was the son of an Irish immigrant school teacher. After his mother's death and a falling out with his family, or with his father, perhaps because he was unwilling to become a priest, he left the family. He apprenticed as a blacksmith, then studied to become a teacher, and taught to make a living in order to read law and pass the bar. He came to Oregon in 1849, settled in Yamhill County, then in 1853 moved south to Douglas County. You'll find with all of these cases, people got involved in politics very quickly. He was elected to the Assembly in 1850. And as a member of the Judiciary Committee, he drafted many of the early laws in the territory and organized and codified those laws after the session. Another was Benjamin Harding, who came, born in Pennsylvania, came from Illinois, settled in Salem with a farm and a law practice. He was soon elected to the Assembly and became Speaker. James Nesmith was born in Washington County, Maine. In middle age, he noted that he had gone to school only a few years of my life, but I have a habit of reading and informing myself, and I believe I now have the best library in the state. As he grew up, he moved west to Ohio and Missouri, and then to Kansas, and he joined the Applegate migration to Oregon in 1843. The party happened to include a number of lawyers, and they passed their time arguing imaginary cases. Nesmith listened and participated with so much aptitude that they encouraged him to study law when he got to Oregon City. 2 years later, he was a judge on the provisional government. Nesmith went to California during the gold rush and had considerable success. He was, throughout this period, by far the wealthiest man in the group. He returned to his wife and children in Polk County, farmed, and established a flour mill. Other members of the clique were all over the territory and served Bush as a way to have all the information he needed, They all left their wives and children on their farms and came to Oregon City because of their interest in politics and government. Very quickly, Bush, mostly because of Matthew Deedy's help, was elected clerk of the Assembly, the lower house, and public printer. He was public printer for nearly the whole time he owned the Oregon Statesman. And as you can imagine, that was a very lucrative, and certainly helped him become a pretty wealthy man. One of the first issues that came up was the question of where the capital should be. Matthew Deedy urged that it move to Salem from Oregon City because Salem was the center of the agricultural parts of the territory. The Willamette Valley, of course, attracted a great many farmers, and most of them came from the valleys of the northern Mississippi, the Ohio, and the Missouri rivers. So they were, for the most part, Democrats. Salem turned out to be a Democratic place. And in fact, Deedy's proposal was partly based on the fact that Oregon City had a lot of Whigs, and they needed to get away from them. At its January 1852 session, the Assembly passed a bill locating the Capitol in Salem, the penitentiary in Portland, and the university in Corvallis. Bush moved his newspaper to Salem as soon as the government was moved to Salem. There was a lot of controversy over the capital move, but it happened, and they settled. The Washington Territory was separated in 1851 by the effort began in 1851. It didn't actually happen until 1853. The people in Washington, and there weren't very many at that time, and felt that they were too distant to be governed from Salem. And the territorial legislature agreed, and so it was created. The Washington Territory was created in March of 1853. Then came Joseph Lane. Lane grew up, moved from North Carolina, Kentucky to Indiana, where he farmed. He was a member of the Indiana legislature from the age 22. He was a major general in the Mexican War. And President Polk appointed him territorial governor in 1848. He quickly gained the respect of the settlers. In fact, even back then, a county was named after him. But then he lost his seat when Zachary Taylor won the presidency and appointed John Gaines governor. Lane had left Oregon briefly, but then returned with three of his sons. He left his poor wife in Indiana with 8 children for most of this period. Bush became Lane's strongest supporter, even though he owed his newspaper and everything else to Samuel Thurston, but people were urging Lane to run for delegate to Congress. Bush's dilemma was solved because Thurston died at sea. His death was announced in the Statesman on May 2nd, 1851, and a week later, the Statesman announced its support for Lane. For all the years, Bush was Lane's greatest supporter. Another political group emerged in Oregon, the Know-Nothings, officially the American Party. Its aim was to keep the territory, the country, in the hands of native-born citizens, to restrict immigration and deny immigrants the right to vote, hold office, or acquire public land. There was a good deal of resentment of foreigners in that period, and particularly of Roman Catholics. The Know-Nothings established lodges called wigwams, and they had secret meetings and passwords and oaths and handshakes. It was actually rather a powerful party, particularly in New England, also in Maryland, Kentucky, pretty much managed politics in those states. The Oregonian, Dreyer, was very supportive of the Know-Nothings. He said he had as his masthead in 1855, "Put none but Americans on guard, Americans in sympathy, feeling, and sentiment, Americans by the provisions of the Constitution of the United States." Bush, however, was able to expose the Whigs, the Know-Nothings, by having his printer kind of sneak his way into the organization. And then he exposed the names, pointed out that a great many of them were Whigs, but a few of them were Democrats. He also got the Know-Nothings weren't very happy with that. They threatened Bush. They demanded the name of his informant. Nesmith tells a story that he and Bush were walking one late Monday evening in Salem, and a group of Know-Nothings surrounded them and threatened to eat us up. We drew our revolvers. Those heroes cooled down and looked very foolish. Bush was able to get past, with the help of the Democrats, a concept known as viva voce, which meant that in order to vote, people had to, men of course, had to announce their votes in a public forum or give them to a judge who would read them. It was not an unusual concept, and of course, now everybody knew who you were voting for, so there was no difficulty. It was very, very valuable to the Democrats. And it was put in the Oregon Constitution when it was written, and remained there until 1872 when it was finally removed. Lane, in his running for the delegate to Congress, had to run every 2 years. It was only a 2-year term, and Lane was very, very good at ingratiating himself with the people. He was the person who made Salem the capital. The capital did move to Corvallis briefly. Bush then moved the Statesman to Corvallis, but wasn't happy with the town. He found its inhabitants, is there anyone here who's from Corvallis? He found its inhabitants the most tackiest, picayune, grabbing people it was ever my lot to fall amongst. And he began working to get the capital back to Salem. Lane made that happen. Not long after they returned to Salem, the Capitol building burned down, and all of its contents were destroyed by a fire that many saw as the work of the Corvallis-inspired arsonist. The clique played a very important role in the formation of the Constitution of Oregon. The ballot had been on the question of statehood had been on the Oregon ballot 4 times before it was finally passed. Even without the approval of the Congress, they called for a constitutional convention. They elected Deedy as the president of the convention, despite the fact that Deedy was a supporter of slavery, as was Lane. And for the most part, the inhabitants of Oregon were very much against slavery. So the convention met on August 17, 1857. A reporter covering the convention, Patrick Malone of the Sacramento Daily Union, wrote that Salem was a town inconsiderable in point of numbers, but territorially omnipotent in point of political power. It is to Oregon what Rome is to Christendom. The Constitutional Convention outlawed slavery. Members of the clique were very, very active, chaired 6 of the 11 committees. They completed their work in September of 1857, but they left 2 issues unsettled. They drafted an article supporting slavery and another prohibiting it, and one allowing African American immigration and the other forbidding it, with the understanding that, depending on the outcome of the vote, the appropriate article would be put in the Constitution. On November 9th, 1857, eligible voters, white male adults, passed the Constitution by a majority of 3,900 votes. They opposed slavery by a vote of 5,082 votes, and they opposed the admission of Negroes by 7,055 votes. That final thing was not repealed until a ballot measure in 1926, which at that point passed by 43,000 votes, of a total of 173,000 passed. The issue of slavery, I'm getting beyond my time. The issue of slavery was a big issue with regard to the acceptance of statehood, the granting of statehood to Oregonians. The South was afraid to add more votes against slavery and did their best to keep Oregon from becoming a slave state. The votes were strong here against it, and it was finally approved that it would come into the Union as a free state, which, as you know, it did in February of 1859. But of course, the big question that was coming was slavery and the threat of civil war. The one last thing I want to talk about is the 1860 election. The Democratic nominee on one side was Stephen A. Douglas. Bush was a huge supporter of Douglas. However, the Democratic convention split, and the southern-leaning people, and when it split, the Oregon delegation went with the Southerners, so that they chose John Breckinridge, who was the vice president at that time, and Joseph Lane as the vice presidential nominee. Bush called Lane the tail of a treasonable ticket. And it was a bitterly fought campaign, particularly in Oregon. And Oregon was the only northern state to give the victory to Breckinridge and Lane. Of course, as you well know, Lincoln won the election. He won in Oregon as well. And then came his presidency and the Civil War. So I'll stop there.
For questions, if people have them. Because we're streaming, you guys get to ask questions, but I'm going to try to repeat it so that people that are watching the stream know what the question is.
2 questions. One, do you know where Matthew Deedy is buried?
So, where is Matthew Deedy buried?
I don't know that. As you know, recently Deedy has been very controversial, and it's true. Deedy supported slavery. He thought that was a way to keep young men on the farm, whereas they would go to cities and be bullies and thieves and so on. He was, I would, however, say, very much a supporter of the Union when the time came. But they talked very much about removing his name from the building at the University of Oregon.
One other thing, at this time period in the 1850s, in Oregon, of course, voting was by white males, but was there also a property owning requirement on that? Or
So the question is talking about who could vote, white males, adult white males, as you said.
Only.
The question is whether there was also a property component to being able to vote.
Yes, or no, to being able to vote. No, not necessarily. If you were a merchant or a businessman, you could vote. So, and if you held public office. So.
It seems inconsistent that Oregonians were opposed to slavery and even more opposed to letting African Americans into the state.
So the question statement was, it seems odd that Oregon was opposed to slavery, but didn't want African Americans to be in the state.
That actually wasn't unusual. It was the law in Illinois, in Indiana. They were anti-slavery, but they felt that having African Americans in the territory or in the state would create a lot of rivalry and fighting, all kinds of things that they just attributed, frankly, to African Americans. Now, there was only one court case where African Americans were, one was kicked out of the state. There were others who were here, for the most part, servants of white families, for all practical purposes, slaves.
You made a statement about the omnipotence of Salem. So why do you think Salem is not that way today? Portland is?
So the question is why Salem isn't omnipotent and Portland seems to be the big city, I guess. Is that a good way to, okay.
That's a very good question. Portland was really a small town. I think the fact that it was able to turn itself into the trade center of the state, or the territory of the state, became, as time passed, more and more important. Its location at the intersection of the Willamette and the Columbia Rivers, all of that. But it was a slow process. It took a while for it to happen. But it also had some very strong people, Lovejoy, for example, who were pushing the importance of Portland. And Dreyer sold the Oregonian to Henry Pittock, who was a huge, huge maker of Portland.
And then the reason was the falls of Willamette City. She couldn't get boats straight from the lower Willamette to Portland. They had to get everything out, ship it. And Willamette, with Buchanan, you could go all the way to Salem Falls and beyond.
All the way to regain our stature.
Yeah, so the answer from Mr. Marsh was that it was the falls at Willamette at Oregon City, and that you couldn't get the ships up and down, so they were in Portland. So it was harder to get to Salem, get the ships here. So, you had another question?
Did the original Oregon Territory include 5440?
So did the original Oregon Territory include 5440?
No, the line was set with that treaty in 1846.
How far east?
How far east?
To the Rockies.
So, Idaho, Montana.
Parts of Idaho and Montana were part originally of the territory, but they drifted away, and they, there was also an effort during the time that they were moving towards statehood to form the state of Jackson, which would be southern Oregon, northern California, and would enter the Union as a slave state. It never came to anything, partly because there wasn't really any interest in Northern California in doing it.
Okay. Oh.
I'm sorry I came in late, so I missed the
bunch, but what was the most surprising thing in your research for this piece?
So the question was, what was the most surprising thing in the research for your book?
I hate to say this, but the more things change, the more they remain the same.
Oh.
It was, I'm sorry. I can see my husband back there frowning at me, so I should know I'm away. The point was that I think the old saying, the more things change, the more they remain the same. As I said to some people earlier, if you think of the 19th century as a time of courtesy and civility, my book will disabuse you of that notion. If anything, I think between Dreyer and Bush and some of the other papers, it was bitter, and things you would not see in a newspaper today.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. As I said earlier, Barbara will be over by the bookstore, and her books will be for sale. Next month is Women's History Month, and so we've got two presentations next month. One is the Norma Paulus story, and the other is a biography of Bev Clarno. Ms. Clarno will be here on the 20th of March, is that right? Have I got the date right? And the Norma Paulus story, the 13th of March. Okay, all right. I'm looking forward to getting your book.